Let's dive into the fascinating world of the Assyrian Civilization, a powerhouse of the ancient Mesopotamian era. The Assyrian Empire, one of history's first true multinational empires, truly set the stage for what we think of today as a mighty empire. Starting in the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians transformed from a regional power into a vast empire covering much of the Middle East. This incredible journey happened between 911 BCE and 611 BCE, marking one of the final, yet most thrilling chapters in ancient Mesopotamia's history. Geographically, the Assyrian kingdom was situated in what is now northern Iraq, bordered by eastern Syria and southeastern Turkey. The Tigris River ran through this region, flanked by the Zagros Mountains to the north and east, and the desert to the west and south. The climate here was cooler and had more rainfall compared to southern Mesopotamia, meaning farming was a bit easier without the need for extensive irrigation. Though deeply rooted in Mesopotamian culture, Assyria developed its own unique characteristics. Positioned between warlike mountain tribes and desert nomads, the Assyrians cultivated a strong military tradition. This military prowess not only helped them survive various invasions, but also enabled them to conquer one of the largest empires the world had seen, stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf and encompassing modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and parts of Jordan, Turkey, Armenia, and Iran. Historically, Assyria was heavily influenced by Sumerian civilization starting from the 4th millennium BCE. By the 2nd millennium BCE, it had risen to prominence as one of the great powers of the Bronze Age Middle East, alongside the Hittite Empire, New Kingdom Egypt, and Babylon. After a period of crisis around 1000 BCE, Assyria bounced back by the mid-9th century, eventually dominating the Middle East for over a century before its dramatic fall at the end of the 7th century. In terms of governance, Assyria was a monarchy, where the king held absolute power as the divinely appointed ruler. His titles included Great King, Mighty King, King of the Universe, King of the country of Ashur. The king was seen as the earthly representative of the national god, Ashur, and was the chief lawmaker, administrator, and commander-in-chief of the army. The king's court was a bustling hub of activity, with ministers, officials, and servants. Key figures included the army chief and the chancellor, who oversaw a large administrative staff. Palace officials managed the royal household and grounds, and some roles, like the chief cupbearer, wielded significant influence due to their proximity to the king. Many officials were recruited from the Assyrian aristocracy, though some came from humble or even slave backgrounds. Notably, a significant number of palace officials were eunuchs, who, theoretically, were dedicated solely to the king's interests. The palace was a center of communication, with a constant flow of correspondence from across the empire. A team of scribes handled these communications, and senior officials determined which matters needed the king's attention. The Assyrian monarchy was hereditary, usually passing from father to son, with one son designated as the crown prince and trained to succeed his father. However, this succession wasn't always smooth, and the Middle Eastern region dominated by Assyria was divided into the Assyrian homeland and a much larger area that, in earlier times, was managed by vassal kingdoms. Over time, much of this territory came under direct control from the Assyrian court, governed by provincial officials. At the heart of this empire was the Assyrian homeland, the political and social center. The capital, Ashur, was not only a political hub but also the center of worship for the chief god, Ashur. Even after Ashur ceased to be the governmental center, it remained a holy city. During its peak, Nineveh served as the capital and was one of the world's largest cities at that time. Other capitals included Nimrud and briefly Dur-Sharrukin under Sargon II. The Assyrians, like most ancient peoples, were primarily farmers. Although all land theoretically belonged to the king, a landed aristocracy also controlled substantial territories. These aristocrats often dominated local governance. To curb their influence, Assyrian kings frequently shifted the capital. Every Assyrian owed duties to the king, with all adult males liable for military service. The core of the Assyrian army was made up of these men, who formed a reserve when not on campaigns. During critical times, a large percentage of younger men were called up for service. They could also be summoned for other duties, such as working on royal estates or large-scale construction projects. Beyond the capital, the Assyrian homeland was divided into districts. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms made these divisions smaller and more numerous, bringing them under tighter central control. These districts were further divided into sub-districts and townships, managed by local chiefs appointed from leading families. Up until the mid-8th century BCE, the Assyrian homeland was surrounded by territories in Mesopotamia, Syria, eastern Anatolia, and western Iran. These areas were composed of vassal kingdoms that owed allegiance to the Assyrian king, providing troops and paying tribute. Most vassal kingdoms were small, except for southern Mesopotamia, which had been ruled from Babylon since Hammurabi's days. This economically vital region was treated with more respect than other areas. The Assyrian king posed as a protector of Babylon, fighting on its behalf, and in return, he expected obedience. From the mid-8th century BCE, Assyria reformed its territorial governance. A third zone was introduced between the Assyrian homeland and the vassal kingdoms, bringing large areas of Mesopotamia and Syria under direct control. Vassal kings were replaced by officials appointed by the Assyrian court, and these provincial governors were supported by garrisons of Assyrian troops. Babylonia also came under direct Assyrian control, but was handled differently. The Babylonian throne was occupied by a member of the Assyrian royal family, initially the Assyrian king himself, ruling through a viceroy. Later, a younger son or brother of the Assyrian king would take the Babylonian throne as a subordinate king. An efficient communication system connected the royal court with provincial governors. Special couriers carried messages swiftly, and fire signals were used for urgent communication. Roads were kept in good repair, bridges were constructed, and paved ways were built through mountainous regions to ensure the swift passage of messages. This system was a precursor to later imperial road networks in the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman empires. The Assyrians also established a state espionage service to monitor potential unrest. By the mid-8th century BCE, Assyria had transformed from a dominant regional power into a true empire with a centralized government, pioneering techniques for administering a vast empire that would influence later imperial states. The Assyrians published their own law code, which was more extensive and detailed than Hammurabi's, though noticeably harsher, reflecting the militarized society it served. And the Assyrian governing system often faced periods of instability. Like many autocratic monarchies, it had a crucial vulnerability, the transition of power. Whenever a king died, especially if they were assassinated, rival princes would compete for the throne, leading to civil wars that sometimes lasted for years. These conflicts weren't just limited to royal family members. Powerful factions within the Assyrian nobility, often based in or around the capital, backed different claimants. Victorious kings sometimes relocated the capital or built new cities to weaken the influence of opposing nobles. During these civil wars, subject peoples frequently attempted to break free from Assyrian control. Despite the harsh reprisals that rebels faced, the Assyrians constantly had to suppress uprisings. Babylonia, with its prestige and wealth, played a pivotal role in Assyrian politics. The practice of appointing younger brothers of the Assyrian king to rule Babylon backfired. Instead of ensuring tighter control, these kings often rebelled against their Assyrian overlords. A notable instance occurred in 652 BCE, when the Babylonian king, backed by Assyria's enemies, revolted against his elder brother, the Assyrian king. This rebellion took years of hard fighting to quell. Another significant rebellion led by a Babylonian king ultimately precipitated Assyria's fall. This king managed to seize the Assyrian throne, but the prolonged civil war allowed subject peoples to assert their independence. Scythians and Cimmerians raided Assyrian territories, and Babylonia broke free. Soon after, Assyria fell to invasions from all sides. Assyria's power rested on its formidable army. While its military practices had roots in earlier Mesopotamian warfare, Assyria introduced significant innovations. It was one of the first armies to use iron armor and weapons extensively. Unlike earlier armies composed mainly of aristocratic warriors and chariots, Assyria's iron weaponry allowed them to arm a larger number of ordinary soldiers, forming substantial infantry and cavalry units. The Assyrians learned cavalry warfare from the Cimmerians and Scythians, nomads from Central Asia. Despite the lack of stirrups or saddles, these horsemen controlled their mounts effectively. Both cavalry and infantry fought as disciplined units rather than individual warriors, a significant departure from the old Bronze Age tactics. Before the mid-8th century BCE, the Assyrian army was primarily a citizen force, with farmers performing military service. Men were stationed in camps and sent on campaigns, with replacements called up as needed. This system evolved to include a standing army of foreign troops from conquered peoples. These soldiers, serving for many years, gained higher levels of training and experience. Permanent garrisons were stationed throughout the empire, maintaining order and supporting provincial governors. The elite troops of the Assyrian army, the Royal Guard, were drawn from these professional soldiers. Assyrian commanders placed great importance on logistics, gathering food and supplies for campaigns, and using camels for transport. A siege train accompanied the army, staffed by engineers who constructed earthworks, dug tunnels, and operated the first recorded siege engines, including battering rams and siege towers. Assyrian imperialism was notoriously harsh. The tribute demanded from vassal kingdoms was heavy, stifling the economic welfare of the subject peoples. This exploitation led to repeated revolts, despite the severe punishments for rebellion. In contrast, the Assyrian homeland showcased unprecedented magnificence and luxury in the ancient Middle East. This disparity indicates that the Assyrian imperial system funneled wealth from the provinces to benefit the ruling class. From the mid-8th century BCE, the Assyrians adopted a policy of mass deportation. Conquered towns and regions were depopulated, with the inhabitants resettled in distant territories. These displaced populations were replaced by people forcibly relocated from other countries. The most notable instance of this practice was the destruction of the Kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, an event chronicled in the Bible. The primary goals of this policy were to punish rebels, prevent further rebellions by disrupting local loyalties, populate new towns, enhance agriculture in underpopulated areas, and provide the Assyrian state with necessary manpower, including troops, laborers, craftsmen, and civil servants. Interestingly, the deportees were not treated as slaves. They retained the rights and duties of other Assyrian subjects and often proved to be among the most loyal. It is estimated that about 4.5 million people were relocated in this manner. Most deportations involved Aramaic speakers, leading to the widespread adoption of Aramaic throughout the Middle East. Aramaic remained the region's dominant language for centuries, even during the time of Jesus, who spoke Aramaic. It was only after the advent of Islam that Arabic began to replace it. Aramaic's simplicity and its alphabetic script, closely related to Phoenician and Hebrew, made it easier to learn and facilitated the spread of literacy. This policy inadvertently promoted education, even as it displaced populations. The Assyrians themselves began to speak Aramaic, although the ruling class continued to use Akkadian and its refined cuneiform script for official purposes. By 752 BCE, Aramaic was made an official language of administration alongside Akkadian, and the Assyrians participated in the broader Mesopotamian religious tradition, worshipping many gods with Ashur, the national god, at the forefront. They deeply believed in omens and signs, interpreting the god's will through various natural and celestial phenomena. No significant decision was made without consulting priests and astrologers, who played a crucial role in guiding state policies. And Assyrian society was divided into three main groups: free Assyrians, meaning not in personal servitude, serfs or dependents on estates, and slaves. Each group had defined rights under Assyrian law, and even slaves were not treated as mere property. Unlike later Roman practices, Assyrian conquests did not lead to a vast slave trade. Conquered peoples became subjects of the Assyrian king and were integrated into society, even if they were deported. At the top of the social hierarchy was the royal family and a landed aristocracy, from which many officials, commanders, and governors were chosen. Most Assyrians were free peasant farmers whose military service formed the core of the Assyrian army. Towns and cities had a typical population of craftsmen and workers, alongside an elite of priests, scribes, merchants, and leading craftsmen. In vassal kingdoms and provinces, existing societies largely continued as before unless completely uprooted. These populations would eventually be absorbed into Assyrian society, creating an international Aramaic-speaking community across much of the Middle East. And the widespread use of iron significantly impacted agriculture and the economy. Farmers began using iron tools, which were more effective than the traditional wooden, bone, or stone implements. However, the high tribute demanded by the Assyrian state stifled economic development in the provinces, leading to impoverishment or stagnation outside Assyria. Despite potential for increased trade due to mass deportations and the spread of Aramaic, there is no evidence of a thriving commercial network during the Assyrian period, likely due to the heavy tribute and constant rebellions. Within Assyria, however, cities like Nineveh, Haran, Nimrud, and Ashur flourished. Kings like Sennacherib undertook vast construction projects, building temples, public buildings, and extensive irrigation systems, benefiting from the wealth extracted from subject peoples. And the Assyrians inherited and preserved the cultural achievements of Mesopotamia. They collected thousands of documents, including myths, legends, and administrative texts, in their vast libraries, contributing significantly to our understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture. Assyrian monarchs were often cultured and refined, interested in zoology, botany, and other scholarly pursuits. They commissioned exquisite works of art and jewelry, as seen in the royal tombs of Nineveh and Nimrud, where stunning artifacts crafted from gold, ivory, alabaster, and semi-precious stones have been found. And Assyrian kings were also passionate builders, erecting magnificent palaces, temples, and public buildings. They laid out beautiful parks and gardens, often creating entire new capital cities. Nineveh, the grandest city of its time, exemplified Assyrian architectural grandeur. Assyrian art introduced a new scale to Mesopotamian sculpture, with massive statues and intricate friezes. These artworks, found in places like the British Museum, depict lifelike scenes with remarkable detail and fluidity. The Assyrians also excelled in landscape gardening, creating vast parks and gardens, possibly inspiring the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon described by Herodotus. Through their policies, military innovations, and cultural contributions, the Assyrians left an indelible mark on the ancient Middle East, creating a legacy that endured long after the fall of their empire.